Welcome to Leadership and People. This is a series that pulls back the curtain on leadership by interviewing CEOs, senior executives, and entrepreneurs who've had large exits. We ask these experts about how they built trusted networks to rapidly grow their companies and what advice they wish they knew if they could do it all again. And this is part 2 of our interview with Marshall Paepke, the CAO at Mountain America Credit Union.
But what ends up happening at work is we talk about things like IDPs, individual development plans. And it becomes so myopic that people are like, well, what should I do? I'll take that course or I'll do this. And so it becomes very granular and people are not real passionate about it.
If you missed part 1, please go back. It was good. He had some really solid advice. I made him a job offer that he should come teach our consulting programs at Myelin. But I want to talk about the people side of it. You know, we talked about leadership in the first part of the interview. And this one, I want to talk more about senior leaders, whether they're running an organization, whether they're a senior executive, and just your approach to both professional development, like getting ideas from your peers, or networking to grow an organization, of the stuff that doesn't show up on the checklist of my job, and just being a part of the community and what that can do for the organization.
Okay, can I take this? I probably take this in a different direction than you're thinking, but so I'm really passionate about people. Okay, so when I started in HR, I actually started because it was the mid '90s, and there was a lot of law coming out of HR. And I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I decided not to be a lawyer, so I just went into HR. After I got into HR, I found the real passion I had was people and engagement. And that's what really drove me, is how do we create a work environment to be an employer of choice and to drive things through people's passion and engagement, engaging individuals. And we've been able to do that here. We've won national, we've won local awards in all different categories. So I feel very satisfied that we've been able to accomplish that as a company. So here's an idea that I came up with the other day, and it's not a new idea, but I don't think people think about their development in this context. Okay, you ready? This is going to blow your mind. So you know a bucket list, right? We all have seen the movie, and it's a great movie. And we get a bucket list, like I want to travel to all over the world, or I want to climb Mount Everest, which I don't, but if you do, that's great. But what ends up happening at work is we talk about things like IDPs, individual development plans. And it becomes so myopic that people are like, well, what should I do? I'll take that course or I'll do this. And so it becomes very granular and people are not real passionate about it. So one day, I like to ride my bike. I'm a cyclist. So I'm out riding my bike and I'm trying to figure out how to solve this problem about development, like you're talking about. How do we keep ourselves developed? And I guess what hit me was what we are really talking about is we're talking about our career bucket list. I want you to think about this idea. So let's say that in your career, so I'm going to ask you, if I say to you, not what are you going to develop yourself at, but I say, what are your goals for your career? Share with me one of your goals. Yeah. Your career bucket list. What's something you want to do?
You know, so I'm running this consulting firm, a media company now, but I really like the Warren Buffett, Richard Branson model of owning companies instead of running them day to day. And so personally, I really like the idea of, I used to run a private equity fund. I really like the idea of running an internal venture capital fund, recycling my own money, but having professional management run the companies.
Great. So let's say that you now write that down on your career bucket list. You don't know if that's going to happen tomorrow. You may come across an opportunity where that actually crosses your path. Or you don't know if that's going to happen 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But by having it written down on your career bucket list, it will happen when you put your energy into it. And also when you open up that idea to the universe. And I know that's kind of like, ooh, we're getting out here in the la-la land of leadership, but I really do believe that as we put things down and write them and take them from a wish status and put them down on paper, all of a sudden we invite other people to become a part of our success of achieving these things. As I've shared this idea in our company, we just with a few people, just changing those words slightly from individual development plan to career bucket list, all of a sudden people started saying, well, I'd like to do this and I'd like to do that, but that's not really in my job. It doesn't matter if it's in your job. If you're developing yourself as an individual, you're developing, and it's going to impact you in ways that you don't understand. So I talked to my boss, our CEO, and said, hey, I have a simple one. I'd like to just go to breakfast with you and the chairman of the board, because every time you guys meet before board meeting, I just like to sit there and listen. So that's not a huge career bucket list item. But what I could gain from watching that interaction and hearing the topics they're talking about, for me in my career where I'm at, would be wonderful. So they can be little, they can be big. But I just would really encourage people from a professional development standpoint not to look at the next class you can take or the next meeting or whatever it might be, but just explore, what do you want to do in your career? If you want to be a CEO, you never know. You may have an opportunity within your company to run a subsidiary. So put it down on your bucket list.
You know, I'm just laughing because, so my mentor, this guy named John Verhessen, who mentored me for 5 years, ended up becoming my business partner and ran that fund. You know, we owned these businesses together for like 12 years. And he got me to like start writing down these goals, but like every month editing them, like, you know, like it's like a constant process of refining. So like I carry these little 3x5 moleskin books with me, right?
Yeah.
And like basically during church is I'm pulling them out. This probably isn't the best thing to admit on a podcast, right? But basically like every week I flip to the back of these moleskins and like you can look at years of them and you can see this list of what's my personal, family, spiritual goals, what's my career goals, right? And it just, and what's funny is I pulled one up from when I was like a 21-year-old. I pulled it up maybe 10 years later. And I hadn't thought about this in years, but I had little drawings of like, I wanted a snowmobiles. I wanted my skateboard ramp. I wanted my black big 4-wheel drive truck. I wanted, you know, and it was like this pretty good list, right? And I was just laughing that I had almost per item exactly what was in this little drawing from a book from 10 years earlier that I hadn't opened in 10 years, you know? And like, so it's funny that you say La La Land, and I get it because people often confuse wishing with something like that, right? But for my own life, like it almost feels like magic that intention about it and talking about it. And like I used to be on a mergers and acquisitions team at Citigroup, and I thought, I want to run a private equity fund instead of just sell companies to them. Mm-hmm. And like by 28, I was a CEO of a private equity fund.
You did it.
And like it sounds too simple to be true. And it does discount all the work and everything else in between those things. But I feel like, anyways, I'm just laughing because I feel like I've experienced that.
Well, I think you're a great example. And I think your stories go to underline the importance of it. So can I tell you one more story real quick?
Please.
So this is a personal, but I think it relates. So in 2004, I started my personal bucket list. And the first item on there was to take my wife to China because both of us had spent some time in Taiwan. And about 2 months later, it was an early morning, and my wife was sleeping still. I was getting the kids ready, which is unusual because I was up, she was asleep. And I had the radio on, which I never have on. And all of a sudden, they came on. There was a contest. And so I picked up the phone, and I started dialing, and it was ringing through. And my wife walked in, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Colin, they have a contest." And she said, "Well, I never win." So being the good husband I'm not, I'm just kidding. I'm a pretty good husband. But I handed her the phone. And she walked in the other room, and all of a sudden, we hear her voice on the radio, and she's won. And guess what she's won?
Trip to Taiwan.
A trip to China.
Really?
For 2, all expense paid.
That's pretty awesome.
That was the first thing on my bucket list, and that's what I talk about when we put these things down. How does the universe play this role in helping us achieve that? Because it will happen. Like you said, it's kind of magical. But all of a sudden, if we put our energy towards the things and we're willing to work, because this doesn't come without work. I had to pick up the phone. I had to dial, right? I had to do something. But anyway, that in 2004 started my bucket list of the things that I want to accomplish. And just yesterday, I was going through it. I just got back from Spain, took my son to Spain, and that was on my bucket list. And so I think we'll achieve more in this life if the things we want to achieve and that we're passionate about, if we'll list those. And like I mentioned earlier, my bucket list isn't to go to climb Mount Everest, so I'm not going to put it on my bucket list just because it's somebody else's wish. In business, I think this concept applies too, right? So when we go and we think and we try and envision the future of our businesses, if we can envision our business becoming something, we can make it happen. But as leaders, we go back to the topic earlier, if we are spending our time making other people's decisions or getting too much in the weeds or not trusting, then we won't have the time or the energy or the effort to really step back and be able to see what we can become as an organization.
You know, it's interesting to think what a simple concept this is. And it seems like, well, you're a big job. You're at an $8 billion organization with $8 billion in assets. Life should be more complicated than writing it down and talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And of course it is. But I wonder if, like, because I think about this idea of like me like writing it in these moleskins all these years over and over. Like there's certain things I've written. I don't know how many times I've written them, you know? And I wonder if it's something about like, you know, the brain is like latching on to things like, you know, we get so much information today, the brain spam filters most of it and latches on to things we've told it's important, right? I wonder if like the nature of writing a list is signaling to our brain that's important. If there's anything like that, latch onto it, you know? And like the nature of the list keeps it front and center for the brain. And then the other side of it is like, it does seem uncanny how much I work hard at something and then I get an extra piece I didn't deserve.
Right.
And it's like, there is something to this, like, I'm focused on it, I'm working at it, and it does seem like I often get that little extra that you couldn't just like have put on a math equation. Do this and you'll get that.
Right.
You know?
It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's that synergy effect, right? So 1 + 1 = 4. But it's because you're doing more than just the work. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know what you did growing up, but I dug a lot of ditches, right? And a lot of hard manual labor. And I got more out of that hard work than just the paycheck. I learned to work hard. And I learned to be willing to do what it takes to get the output I wanted. And now later in life, I think I've benefited and helped with my career because I was willing to work hard when others may not have been willing to work as hard or think as hard. Because sometimes I think that's more important today, is how hard are we willing to think as opposed to work.
Yeah, I'd actually love to talk about this. You know, you think about how easy it is if we're skilled at a certain job function or something, we've now been promoted, we're in charge of people, whatever. It's like maybe earlier in the career, like putting in the harder, you know, working 20% harder than the other guys and whatever, so it makes the difference, right?
Right.
But it does seem like later on, the like problem comes up and immediately getting to work on it doesn't always feel as helpful. And like I get frustrated and then I have to go back and realize like, oh, I need to outthink this problem, not outwork it.
Right.
Why do you think people like me, why do you think that's harder to like stop and think harder instead of just nose down and work harder?
I think it comes to how our society's developed, that we want to see output. And so, you know, solving one major problem doesn't seem like shifting a stack of email or a stack of paper on our desk. But the real trickle effect or ripple effect is much greater than the emails or the to-do lists. So I think we need to value things probably differently, put a different value on the impact. And I think part of that is how fast we're running, because we're running from meeting to meeting, we're running from assignment to assignment. Do we take the time, and this is where I go back to my other sentiments about work-life balance, do we have the time and are we taking the time to think and ponder? And I can tell you, this has been a challenge for me. I haven't in no way mastered this. When I do it, I'm much more effective in life. And when I don't do it, I'm much less effective. And again, I don't know if I can talk about a product here on your show or not.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So one of the best books I've ever read is called Becoming Your Best by Steve Schallenberger. Oh, have you read that?
No, I'm a real book nerd. I'm excited.
Okay, I'll give you one before we leave. And this book has 12 principles. And I am a big believer if people will follow those 12 principles, they will change the way and the who they are, because it's really about becoming. So who we are today may not be who we want to be tomorrow, but are we willing to become the person we could and can become?
I love that idea. I always love stories. Can you think of somebody that you feel like has set the example for that, or times you've seen that in a coworker or a boss or just somebody else you've observed of like they've lived that more than maybe the average? Because advice, it's easy to hear advice, but sometimes the like seeing when somebody else did it makes it stick in for me.
Yeah. So for me, I've had the chance to meet Steve Schallenberger and go to lunch with him and whatnot, and just hearing his stories about his life and starting businesses at a very, very young age. And these principles aren't new principles. I mean, when people look at the 12 principles, like pre-week planning, right? So at the end of the week, are you ready and planning for the previous week? Like writing down and looking at your next week's schedule and making sure the things on your calendar that you have prioritized are really important. And if they're not, then remove them. Right? Makes sense, but how many of us are willing to do it?
Yeah, it's like simple but hard.
Yeah. And so watching Steve Schallenberger and talking to him through his life and how he prioritizes things, and guess what? The number one thing I see Steve prioritize are people.
Tell me about that.
Are people. Well, just like me, he came and he spoke to us. We brought him up and he spoke to our whole leadership team and with his son Rob. And I said to Rob, hey, I'd love to go and meet your dad more. And this is the first time he'd ever presented our company. And they said, well, he doesn't necessarily always do that. And I was like, all right, because he's kind of a big deal. And then all of a sudden I get a call from Steve and he's like, hey, when do you want to go to lunch? Yeah, I heard you want to go to lunch with me. And so here's a guy running a multi-million-dollar companies and whatnot. And now he's going to lunch with me. And so that I was important enough to him for him to prioritize that time. And he told me his life story. And I learned from his experience of seeing not only how he applied these principles, but how he lives his life. And so he's been a phenomenal example to me of some of these principles. And I can tell you, a couple of years ago, I really practiced this pre-week planning just as one of the principles. And it changed me. It changed my time. It changed my energy. It changed my passion, because what was on my calendar and my schedule were the things that were really important. When I became after that a little bit more lackluster about continuing that habit, guess what happened? I kind of got back in the grind. And so doing it effectively and well ongoing, consistency and consistently are really critical to us. Sometimes we get busy. Oh, I don't have time for that. Do you really not have time for that? Or do you really not have time not to have time for that? And I think that's a critical thing for all of us. Like, what's our morning routine? You've read books. Some of the most successful people have routines. And those routines are what they follow all the time. Why? Because it's what helps them be effective or successful.
I love it.
So, and one last thought. So you asked this, but I really do believe in this idea, and it kind of this ties all of this together, I think, is, there's scriptural references to stuff like this, but I think you could find it probably in anything. But basically, as someone thinketh, they become. And so wherever we spend our time thinking, that really is going to predict what we become. If we spend our time thinking doubtfully, then we probably aren't going to have success. If we spend our time thinking about how we are going to accomplish something, or how that person can be successful, or how that person is good, and focus on their qualities, their positive qualities, we're going to have a whole different life experience as a leader than if we spend our time thinking in a negative way. So how do we create positivity? How do we create engagement? Because people want to be around that person that's positive. People want to be around the people who can see the future and see it in a positive way. They don't want to be around the person who's always seeing things in a negative light. So anyway, just a thought.
No, I love it. I actually think that's a great place to end. I think that's something we could all do better at.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to visit with you.
Yeah, it's been great.
Hi, my name is Logan Wilkes, and I'm the CEO of Corporate Alliance. A few years ago, I moved to San Diego to build a new market for us there. The biggest deterrent I had to success was I didn't know a soul. I often thought to myself, if I just had a thriving network or influence, this would go 100 times faster. To be honest with you, I had never felt so alone in my life because A, I didn't have an influence, and B, I didn't know anyone that was going through the same thing that I was. If you have ever felt like this and you are looking to grow your influence, join us at one of our upcoming events. You can check us out at corporatealliance.net and request an invite to one of our upcoming experiences.